Hi, on this video we're going to cover the main features of the modulated dynamic point lights and blob shadows asset for UE4. So this was originally intended for mobile platforms to overcome the hard limit of the maximum 4 dynamic point lights, but it turns out that it's a really cheap way to render lights for any platform that has some constraints in terms of performance. So what you will get with the package is that this is a very simple light actor here, and the way it works is you just add it to your scene as if it were a normal light. You can change the size, you can change the color and the intensity. It's also possible to change the exponent, which is basically how sharp the light will be. And you also get some glowing and flickering effects, which are essentially free, and we're going to cover that in a minute. The package also contains some blob shadows, which are some really interesting effects because these shadows will change according to the position of the meshes, and they will also adapt to any mesh surface, and you can also change the color of the blob shadow. These lights have some differences with the default UE4 lights. So on one side, they are really cheap. Basically, they have no memory footprint at all, and they have a very low runtime cost. So if you use the default mobile point lights, you will have to do the 4 dynamic point lights. You will have to do extensive shader permutations, which will increase the size of the product and will also increase the runtime cost. So they increase the memory allocation. But in this case, these are very simple meshes that have simple materials. They have roughly 76 instructions each, so they are really cheap, and they are not generating any additional overhead. Now, there are some limitations of this technique, and the first one is that these lights don't cast any shadows. They also don't have any specularity, and finally, they are not directional. Let me show you an example of this. So if I get a normal point light here, and I get my character close to it, you will see that the light is actually affecting only one side of the character, right? Because it's affecting, it's using the vertex normal of the character. So it's not lighting the back. But if I get close to a modulated light here, you will see that the light is actually affecting the entire character, and it's basically being defined by the distance to the center and by the exponent that we chose. So this is a disadvantage of this technique, but it can also be very useful. For instance, if you want to have a light radius around your character, you don't really want the light to come just from one side, you just want it to come from the entire mesh. And it can also be very useful if you want to have smooth lighting over a specific surface. So for filler lights, this is a very good option as well. Now the final effect that you get is the flickering effect here and the glowing. And the reason I think that this is essentially free is because these blueprints right now are not doing anything. So the blueprints only take care of the construction part here, so they are only used once and then we just forget about them. And everything is being done on the material shader. I'm going to hide this flickering light for a minute and show this one in detail. So what you get with the glow effect is you can change, of course, the color intensity exponent, but you can also change the frequency of the glow. So I can, this is measured on a per second basis. So if I change this to 1, it will run once per second, the glow effect. And I can change this to 2, 5, any number. So if I get 10 here, it will flicker 10 times per second. Now I can also change the glow here. So let's say that I change this to 2 and the maximum glow to 2 as well. You can see that the light is actually turning on and off constantly. So with the I could, for instance, change this to be a red light, and then we have an alarm light, and it was really easy to do. Now, if you had to do this on a normal point light, you will have to use a blueprint, and you will or C++, and you will have to use an effect on tick or using a timeline. And that, if you compound it with many meshes over time, you will have too many actors ticking, and that will have a big impact on your performance. On this case, you can have hundreds of lights on your scene that are constantly glowing or flickering, and they have no cost, no additional rendering cost at all. So there's no CPU cost, everything is done on the material shader, and it only has 76 instructions, so it's quite cheap in that sense. Let's head over to the shadows. So these are blob shadows. The way they work is that they are basically a sphere mask around the character. You can see that these are not real shadows, so they are not reacting to the light on the scene, but they can really improve the quality of a mobile project. And what's interesting here is that if I move the character around, you can see that the shadow changes the size. We can see this, we can play this. You can see that the character is jumping and the shadow is changing the size according to the position. Uh, it's also being perfectly adapted to any other surface. And you can see here the character is running and has two shadows, one on each feet, and it also generates an interesting effect, kind of an ambient occlusion. So there are some features that you can do here. Let's have a look at the setup. This is a very simple character. You can see that this is just a basic character that has a static mesh that is attached here. And I just place it on the feet of the character. It's just this mesh that you get with the product and this blob shadow material. Let's have a look at the material. You can see that it only costs 81 instructions, so it's not really expensive either. And there are some things that you can change here. So on one side, you can modify the shadow color. So you can have red shadows, purple shadows, whatever you want. You can also change the hardness of the sphere mask. So let's say that this is let's use a 1 here. You can see that now it's the perfect sphere and it's not actually blending with the environment. This might be useful, I guess, for some stylized games maybe. But if you want more realistic effect, you can start reducing this number. And I think that 0 is actually a good number. But you can actually have even lower numbers if you want to have a less contrast. You can also change the maximum shadow opacity here. So let's have a look. So right now you can see that this is at 1 and the hardness is at zero point 0.5. And what's happening here is that the center of the shadow is actually way too dark, and this is not really how shadows work. So what we can do here, if you want a more smooth shadow, we can reduce the opacity of the entire shadow. So let's say that it's zero point 0.5. You can see that now the shadow looks much smoother on every part. And of course you can play around with the hardness, color and opacity to get the proper result you want. So that's what we have. I think that this is a very useful package that has some limitations, like the shadow and specularity and the light directionality that we just spoke about earlier. But I think that it's a very cheap way to lighten your scenes. I think that you can have unlimited dynamic point lights on mobile games and other platforms. So it can be really useful. So please, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email at the address that you can find on the description below. Thank you.